and I'm taking the chair's prerogative by asking a couple questions, and then we'll open up to the audience. So, beautiful film, really was beautiful film. I noticed that the original title was called The Seer, and that seems reasonable, when you talk about Wendell Berry. And the seer is like ground in the present, but talking about the future, right? And of course, seers are not often welcomed by their societies. But I'm just wondering what caused the change in the title.
The reason why we called it The Seer originally was because, the film really is, I call it a portrait of Wendell Berry because that's what it was in my mind from the beginning. It's what it still is. But a lot of viewers are confused because you're not looking at him, doing a full front interview with him. And so I wanted to evoke this idea that you're seeing through his eyes, that it's the way Wendell sees the world rather than the way the world sees Wendell. And there's a lot of reasons behind the reason why we chose to do it that way. But to answer your question, the seer also sees the future and has this kind of prophetic lens, which I think any of you who've read Wendell Berry might agree with me that he has that, and then some. And but Wendell did not like that title. He didn't tell me. Tanya told Jeff at the Henry County Harvest Showcase when we were there in Henry County to show the film. And, they knew the title, but they were just reluctant to tell us that Wendell absolutely hated the title. And we were like, wish you would have told us that. So I wrote to Wendell and told him we were going to change the title. And he wrote back to me explaining the reason why he disliked the title. He said it gives me more attention than I deserve or can deal with. And so, he told me several times that he is nothing but for his place and for the people around him, and that our culture likes to make idols of people and that that's not real. And so very early on I said to him, well, I don't need to film you. There's no reason to film you. I'll film your place. I'll film the people you see and you love, and that is who you are. And that was the whole concept, So Look and See seemed to us to come from Mary Berry's, the way she talks about how her parents always told her to look and see. And it seems more Wendell, really, as a kind of command, telling all of us to look, not just look, but to then see what's there. So it seemed more fitting, and he appreciated it.
It's also changing out a noun for verbs, so it really it's more action.
Yeah.
One thing I was very struck by watching it a couple times, that the opening sequence, some critics say it reminds them of Koyaanisqatsi, Life Out of Balance, with that apocalyptic feel. I think it's a little bit more along the lines of this underappreciated film from 2007, What a Way to Go, Life at the End of Empire, by Timothy Bennett, which has a voiceover rather than music. But be that as it may, can you give us some insight in terms of the way to combine the Berry's narration with these images of destruction and mechanization? Just to give us some idea about how that worked, and I think it's quite effective as a beginning.
Sure, yeah. This is where I wish Jeff were here. We kind of divide and conquer because he took the little ones home to bed. But basically, I wanted to make a film that simply transported you to Wendell's world, that was totally a departure from the world we're in. And so I started the film with that walk down the woods, and I didn't want any of the noise of the world we're in. And I thought the film was done. And Jeff said, no, we're going to be showing this at film festivals and at South by Southwest. And, all these people are going to be coming in off the streets off their cell phones. And you need a transition. And he's the one who found that poem and thought that poem was just so pertinent to our day and our culture. And he wanted to cut it with footage that was such a clear departure from the world of Wendell, but that was really from the world we all live in. And so he cut that completely on his own. And so this is the prologue that has to start. It's a transition. And I think another thing he often says that I think is important to mention is that y'all are in Indiana. Like, I'm from a rural background originally. But a lot of urban viewers don't really think that the rural pertains to them at all, particularly in our culture today, this sort of rural urban divide. And I think that was on Jeff's mind a lot too, is that Wendell calls you out, whoever you are, you pertain to the stories. It's not just farmers from rural Kentucky. I think that poem and the way he cut it is communicating that. It's saying, this also pertains to you.
Yeah, I think it's quite effective. It really is. My last question. One theme from the critical reaction argues that this is actually two films, an homage to the Kentucky prophets of rural values and a brief exploration of the farming community in Barry's neighborhood. One is a lovingly curated biopic. The other is in the style of cinéma verité. You think the critics are onto something?
I like critics. I think it's really good to have criticism. So sure, maybe they're onto something. I personally think a lot of documentaries oversimplify things, and I'm not particularly interested in that. I want to see something that reflects the real space of something, and that's often complicated and doesn't fit into a simple three-act structure. I remember my film professor, I won't mention his name, when I was in grad school, said to me at one point, he said, "Laura," he put his arm around me, very, fatherly like, and said, "The problem with your filmmaking is that you don't know how to tell stories." And I didn't really worry too much about that at the time. I think that to me, this sort of three-act structure is helpful, but as a documentarian, I'm interested in the nonfiction space because it doesn't fit into that ever. And I'm not so interested in you sitting there thinking about what a great filmmaker I am. I'm more interested in creating a space for you to inhabit and have your own experience. And so I think the best documentaries, we were talking about Frederick Wiseman and Albert Maysles and these classic documentarians that are not drawing attention to themselves as filmmakers, but are more creating this transparent lens. You're just in somewhere. So if you felt transported somewhere else, wherever that may be, then I feel like that was a success. And I think if I oversimplify things and try to make it too neat of a package, it's more about my own, authorship than it is about a space for the audience. So that would be my polite defense.
Well, I was transported, no question. So let's get some questions from the audience. And I will repeat the question after the person wants to talk. So any questions or comments from the audience? Come on, guys. Yeah. So the comment was that she doesn't want to read Wendell Berry at night because it's too disturbing. But she's
Wakes her up.
it wakes her up in that way, and that she's thanking Laura for doing this film.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really humble challenge to try to make a film about one of your favorite writers and artists, and I think Jeff said it well at the beginning. That it's you can't ever expect to sort of kind of capture that, and I think reading is in some ways I imagine some people here might disagree with me, but is in some ways a superior art form in that it requires so much of your own personal imagination and investment, and it's so intimate, and so my own experiences with Wendell's books are really important to me personally, and so I just wanted to make a film that might capture some little essence that might make people who didn't know Wendell read Wendell, and then might make people who love Wendell Berry like I do just reminded and encouraged, because you're kind of going against the grain with your values. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for asking. We're totally a mom and pop shop. It it did just go onto Netflix, so that's a really great victory for us. So people can see it that way, which is great. And then there'll be a shortened version, like a 53-minute version on PBS in the spring, which is also great. Yeah, independent lens. And then DVDs and Blu-rays, and we're putting together an educational guide for universities and colleges and high schools. Anyway, we are making those ourselves, and we're selling those ourselves. And so at lookandseefilm.com, and we're shipping them all out. Our boys have helped package them, so we're shipping those out starting December 1st. So thanks for asking.
Yes. Did people hear the question? Okay.
Yeah. Well, there's so much to say there, and he's written really interesting things about it. He has an article called "The Problem with Tobacco," I think is what it's called. He also has another article called "In Defense of the Tobacco Farmer," which I think is interesting. And so it's a complex history, and he can give it a lot more justice than I can. This is my take on it from being around it and asking all those same questions, is that, first of all, I think there is a tendency sometimes, particularly in Southern agrarian history, to throw out everything about it because there are some negative things attached to it. In other words, the history of the tobacco farming in rural Kentucky is beautiful in the sense that it was a handmade crop. It wasn't a big, large-scale crop. It depended on community and culture to support it. And there wasn't a mechanization that could really take that away from the community until fairly recently. And the tobacco co-op, which is what Wendell's father and his grandfather supported, was basically a cooperative farming economy in Kentucky that really controlled supply. And you could really do that with tobacco, especially because if you didn't sell it all that year, it could go in a pool for next year. It wasn't like broccoli, you couldn't hold it over for an extra year. But they cooperatively controlled the amount of tobacco that was released in the market that year, and so it kept the prices at a stable place. And so it meant that a farmer could support a family on 5 acres of tobacco every year. And so it created an economy that was at a scale that was sustainable, and it was culture-based and community-based, and there wasn't outside labor. It was neighbors working together. And so there's all these lessons to learn from the way people farm tobacco in Kentucky, that I think his argument is, yes, tobacco, health problems, we understand. But this was before the big, huge companies were coming in and doing all the things they did. So his point is, look at it as a case study for sustainable agriculture and for ideas around sustainable agriculture economically, community-wise, the scale-wise, and learn from it. Don't just say because it has these health issues that we now know about, throw all that history and all that knowledge out. And I think that's a compelling way to think about it. I think sometimes you have to look at Southern agrarian history and pick those things apart and try to find where there are lessons to be learned, because there are lessons, even if there's other things that were wrong. You know what I mean? That's my take. I think that today in Kentucky, and then the tobacco we filmed, it was a beautiful crop to film. I mean, just the handmade quality of it and the process of it. And so I'm not trying to romanticize cigarettes, but to look at agriculture from that lens, I think is interesting.
More questions? Yeah.
Lee Daniel. He asked about Lee Daniel, the cinematographer. He asked if I have any good stories about working with Lee Daniel. Do you know Lee? Oh, yeah. Okay. I've known Lee about 20 years. He's a cinematographer for the film, and he shot our last film also. So he's like an uncle to my kids. We love Lee. Lee is a really talented cinematographer, and I think the way that I talk about working with Lee, and we've learned this together, is that I give him a lot of space. He really wants just natural light. He doesn't like things staged. I always say I think Lee unframes things as opposed to put things in a box. So we chase the light, and I give him the best equipment I can give him, and then I let him do his thing. It's a pretty natural kind of working relationship. Um, I'm sure I have a lot of good stories about working with Lee. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that he might want me to share. But Lee's really interesting too because Lee was in a car accident about 15 years ago, and he doesn't have any use of his left arm, and so he struggles a lot when you're dealing with big, heavy cameras. And we only had a 4-person crew. It was Jeff and me, and our sound guy and Lee usually, with a big Arri Alexa or Arri Mura cameras. And so Lee, he's heart and soul getting through that to do those shoots, and I think you can feel that. And I think the people who we filmed, the Berries, for example, he's very calming. He's a calming presence. He's not someone who's going to kind of assault you with a camera or a lens. Because the people in rural Kentucky were not particularly impressed that we were there with a camera. They had absolutely no interest in participating, and were very difficult to earn their trust. And I think Lee was a key to sort of making people comfortable, his disposition towards it all.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's a heavy question. And I think that when he talks about displacement, and I'll tell you this is my take on it a little bit too, is that those guys who worked in those fields and that large scale tobacco farm were wonderful guys, and we got to know them. And I felt the sadness that there was an economy that was dependent on displacing people from their families for 8 months out of the year. I have young children, and like Jose and Juan, they would talk to me about that off camera, about how they hadn't seen their kids in 8 or 9 months. And yeah, it was a good job and it was giving them money, but that we live in a world that where, like our agriculture is dependent on that kind of situation. So there's a displacement, but it's not I don't think that Wendell, and I'm not trying to imply with the edit, that it's displacing, that those people are displacing my people. Those people are displaced from their homes. Why can't they make sustainable incomes on their land? One of them farms tobacco in Mexico, but he can't make a living on it. So it was kind of talking about an economy that displaces people from their homes and their families. I think that Wendell is concerned about a large scale agriculture that displaces people from their own homes and farming where they are, because it's not an attack on that particular person. Does that make sense? I have had a lot of questions about that, though, and from different audiences. And it was interesting, even talking with PBS, they were really upset that I had the Latino workers in there. And I was like, well, it's an ethnographic portrait. Like, I'm simply filming what is there. And they're an important part of that story right now. And actually, they're human beings who have families and have lives and have perspectives and work really hard. And, I wanted to represent them in some way. It felt weird to me to not represent that. And so then they said, well, we want you to cut that out. I was like, really? Like, that's kind of weird. And then they said, well, if you're going to keep it in, then you need to talk about the history of slavery in Kentucky. And I thought, well, I get it, because agrarianism in the South and slavery, I understand. My family's from Mississippi. Like, this is a painful part of history. But if you simply look at that place right now, Henry County, Kentucky, right now, it's not slavery pre-Civil War. It's something else. And you could argue that industrial agriculture is on a continuum with that exploitation, and that the small-scale agrarian farms, many of them never had slaves because they were too poor. That's the kind of farming we're talking about. And it's really industrial, pre-industrial as the contrast. And so anyway, PBS decided, I said, well, have you read The Hidden Wound? have you read Wendell's work about racism and the pain of it? He writes really beautifully about it and sensitively. And they backed off a little bit. And then they said, well, then put the Latinos back in there. We need diversity. I was like, okay, I think sometimes our politics, make us not be able to just let's see what's there and trust that we can talk about it sensitively and help each other understand the differences. The provincialism of the small town that I think you're kind of getting at is real. And I don't think any of us can do away with that. But the wood engravings he's asking about. So the way I make films is and I wish Jeff were here because he could speak really humorously about it, because he thinks it's so madness, because I don't have like a script and a structure. I just want to absorb the place and let the place transform my way of seeing and then find my way out with 100 hours of footage. And it's very messy and expensive and takes forever. And he's just like, he's much more hierarchical in his structure. And so it's an interesting discourse. I wish you could hear some of it. But basically I wait until the last minute. I see patterns. I see the seasons, or I see a kind of historical frame from Wendell's life story. And as I'm editing, I'm trying to find those patterns. And Terrence Malick, who's a big mentor of mine, always says to me too, edit things like it's a piece of music. Let there be tangents and characters that come up and out and don't necessarily go anywhere, or find scenes you like and build around them. So that takes a long time. And it's really only at the last minute that I impose some kind of structure on it, because I know it's necessary. And one night I was editing and I was trying to figure out, what's the structure here? I didn't want to do 4 seasons. It's a little cheesy. Like, what do you do? And I was sitting there, I had like a whole bookshelf, of all these Wendell Berry books. So I started flipping through his essay collection. And all of them have, these chapters that have a kind of poetic title, and then they have they're exploring that theme. And so I said, well, we make it like a book, duh, And so just kind of broke it up into chapters, and I knew the titles of the chapters. And then Jeff said, look at these wood engravings that are in these books. Like, let's contact him. Maybe he'll do some images. So Wesley Bates is a wood engraver, one of the world's best, and he's based out of near Ontario, outside of Toronto. And Jeff started up a conversation with him. And it was a collaborative process with Jeff and me and Wesley. We'd talk about each scene, and he would come up with a sketch. And then when he'd finally get it, he engraves those images. It seems like that on a block of wood. They're incredible. And so yeah, I think that made a big difference of trying to keep the kind of analog aesthetic in the film.
And so he was actually in the film.
Yes. Well, he filmed himself. We sent him a little camera, and he set it up and filmed himself doing a little wood engraving. We couldn't afford to get up to Canada, but.
Okay, I think we have one more time for one more question. So over here.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a couple quick things. I think in terms of the literacy, I definitely thought, was there an experiment? Can you make an anti-screen screen? I always said this to Wendell. Can you make a film that would make people want to turn away from the screen and go into a book? Maybe want to go for a walk in the woods, or actually look at their child, It was sort of this experiment. So I hope that it encourages people to read. It's kind of antithetical to our culture now, unfortunately. But in terms of Terrence Malick, so I had the great fortune. I graduated from UT Film School and was going to go to Israel and do some work on water there. But it was very violent at the time, so I said, I'm going to wait a little bit. And I had volunteered to do a PSA for the local Save Our Springs Alliance in Austin, Texas, where I live. And Terry was a member, and he said, oh, I've seen her grad work. I actually want to do a whole film on it. It was one of those, like, I didn't earn it. I really didn't. He's a generous person. He kind of gives you way more than you deserve and expects you to rise up to it. So I worked with him then, and that was from 2002 to 2007 on The Unforeseen is that film. And he really shepherded me through that. You know, it's the kind of thing where you talk with him, and then you write a little one-page treatment, and then you send it to him, and he calls you and shreds it to pieces, and you start all the way over again. You know, any good teacher does that, right? And then it was a lot of like conversations with him. Like, these are the people I'm interviewing, and then he would tell me, oh, you need to go to see this person and that person. And I was telling John, I think the big influence Terry. And so then Terry agreed to help me on this one too. And so he watches my cuts. I'll have conversations with him. It's really the thinking. And I think what he has done for me is to challenge me to look beyond the literal, you know, to not always, do things like a journalist. He'd always say to me, like, don't just do things chronologically. Look at what's happening and then figure out what the forces are behind what's happening and ask why, you know. Or he would say, take Barton Springs as that which God gave us and look at what we're doing to it. Or he'd say, see the whole world through a grain of sand. You know, these kinds of like huge philosophical questions that as a kind of a literal documentarian, it's like, huh? Like, what do I do with that? And it challenged you to look much more metaphorically and poetically at the world around you. So that's his primary influence. He's a wonderful teacher. I'm so grateful for him.
Well, we have to end this program. Thank you so much, Laura and Jeff, for a wonderful film.